So we've just started a whole new theme, a wonderful theme, looking at great Buddhist teachers of the past. And these Buddhist teachers have been taken from this incredible visual image of our lineage, of Triratna's lineage, known as the Tree of Refuge and Respect. And I realise even this large version of it is still going to be quite hard to see from the back. But essentially, we have the Buddha at the centre of our tradition, the historical Buddha, and around him are all these figures, including Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, Sangha, of course, the founder of Triratna, but also his teachers when he was alive, and also teachers of the past, which are sort of right up here in the sort of murky regions up here. And you can just about see the figure I'm going to talk about up there. So this is the Refuge Tree, and we'll be exploring the lives and teachings of just some of the teachers on this tree to really look at their particular radical Dharmic approaches and looking at how they can inspire our own lives and our own practice. Last week, Sangha Gita looked at the life of this great mythic Tibetan figure, Milarepa, drawing out particularly the depth and intensity of his commitment to practicing the Dharma, and his incredible loyalty to his teachers. And she was describing all the things that he was put through in a way to test him. This week, we're going to be exploring a somewhat different figure, but nonetheless a very, very important figure coming from the Japanese tradition called Shinran. And he's one of actually 4 Japanese figures which are on this refuge tree. And Shinran actually inspired what was to become the largest Buddhist school in Japan, called the Jozo Shinshu, the true Pureland school. And it had over 20,000 temples in Japan and many temples around the world, in the US and so on. I mean, as a sort of, it's the largest school in Japan, and it's probably one of the largest schools in the world. Despite this, until recently, there's actually been very, very little interest in the West in what is called Shin Buddhism, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because you may wonder why. I mean, people are interested in Zen, they're interested in Theravada, Tibetan, but Shin Buddhism has largely been neglected, despite the fact there are tens, indeed hundreds of thousands of practitioners actually in the US who are Japanese immigrants. So anyway, but to be honest, I had hoped that Shinran would come a bit later in the order, because it might have been quite handy to have more of the sort of mainstream figures, if you like, teachers, before we get to Shinran, because Shinran in a way is pretty unusual, almost a bit odd to our Western sort of temperament, if you like. Some would say, actually, that him and his teachings are not even Buddhist. But I hope to show you that actually, nonetheless, he's a hugely inspirational figure and has been to me. So let's start with the life of Shinran. He was born in 1173 and died in 1263. So he had a good life, a good innings. But I want you to imagine really a very different place and time. So we're going back to medieval Japan, at a time of great strife and wars and so on. Really not that unlike, I think, Europe at that time, where there's all kinds of wars and conflicts, crusades, and so on going on. I realise there are parts of the world now that are suffering similar sort of war-torn sort of situations, but this was Japan at the time of Shinran. And he wrote, like the cherry blossom, the heart planning on tomorrow is ephemeral indeed. What storm may not arise in the middle of the night? So yeah, things were pretty tough. You never really quite knew whether you were going to survive the night. Anyway, at that time in Japan, there was this well-established and really quite elitist form of Buddhism called Tendai Buddhism. It was monastic, but in many ways it was quite worldly and was probably the most influential school in the imperial courts in Japan. Now Shinran, his parents died when he was just 8 years of age. And at that age, he went off to a monastery and became a hall monk at this huge monastery at Mount Hiei. You'll have to forgive my Japanese pronunciation in this talk, which was the center of this school, the Tendai school. So it was the place to go if you were a Buddhist. But he was a hall monk. Now, a hall monk, from what I can gather, is somebody who quite literally ate, slept, and meditated in the hall. Okay, we don't have anybody doing it here, but we do have some people just next door in the community, which is as near as we probably get to it. So it was quite lowly. In a sense, his position was quite lowly. And he practiced diligently. He practiced really, really hard for 20 years. I mean, full on. But he had a crisis. After 20 years of practicing like this, practicing in the ways that he'd been taught, practicing assiduously as he could, he had a crisis. And this crisis was that, well, he felt he'd failed. He felt he'd failed as a monk. He felt actually his practice, in a way, just wasn't getting anywhere. And this really tormented him because he'd given everything to this. And he was also quite disillusioned with monastic life because he felt that actually it was too worldly. So anyway, it was said that he went off to a very intensive retreat and had a vision of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who directed him to another disillusioned Tendai monk called Honen. Now, Honen was the leading sort of Japanese teacher of the Pureland tradition, which had started in Japan. And Shinran remained loyal to Honen right until he died as Honen's disciple. He never referred to himself as a leader or as a guru, anything like that. He always saw himself as a disciple of Honen, even though for most of his years he didn't actually spend time with Honen. Anyway, so he joined Honen's sort of group, his followers, and not long after, the Buddhist establishment at that time really didn't like Pureland Buddhism. And I suspect this is probably because they found it as a bit of a threat to them, because in a way it didn't need them. And I'll explain a bit why in due course. It didn't need them. So they managed to persuade the local military rulers to ban their main practice, the Nembutsu practice, which I will be talking about, and decided they executed two of his followers. They exiled Honen and Shinran. Now, poor old Shinran was actually sent to the back and beyond, and also he was defrocked, which I think is a wonderful expression, defrocked. And he was sent to a place then known as the Echigo province in northern Japan, which is apparently a very wet, very cold, very snowy place. It has more snow than Moscow, apparently. It has 296 days, this is an average, I presume, 296 days of precipitation a year. So you've got to imagine a very, very cold Manchester. I think that's probably the nearest we can get to it. So poor Shinran got exiled to this place. And he had to live amongst the poor who were just scratching a desperate living from fishing, farming, and so on. And he noticed something about the local people. He noticed that actually they really had no time for Buddhist practices. It was so tough to live in those conditions and to be able to feed your own families. You had no time to meditate. Obviously, they were illiterate, so they couldn't study. Many of them had to fish to feed their families. If they didn't fish, the families would die. So they were also having to break precepts. And he saw this, and he sort of thought, well, actually, what I want to do is to bring Buddhism to these people, because they're kind of ignored in many ways by a lot of the monks in their sort of fine monasteries. And this exile, as grim as it was, actually became a real turning point in his life, because he wanted to bring Buddhism, as I say, to ordinary people and not just to monks. And this brings me to a key aspect of many traditional Buddhist schools and practices, is this division between monks, if you like, and everybody else, brackets, lay people. Okay. And this division sort of really underpins established Buddhism. Now, Shinran was truly radical in saying that he was neither monk nor lay. Okay, so in a sense, in the end, he was happy to be defrocked, actually, because even before he was exiled, he got married, he had children, or at least his wife did, and he even ate meat. Okay, which was shocking to people at the time, that somebody who called themselves a monk would do such a thing. And when he was defrocked, he actually named himself, gave himself a new name, Gotoku. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, Gutoku, which actually means foolish, stubble-headed one. Okay, so and a few of us in the order are sort of heading that way ourselves as well. But you could see, you know, he had a sense of humour as well. But you could see he was a very humble guy. Now this has real echoes with Triratna, because Sangha has been trying to establish Buddhism in the West. That was what he really wanted to do, to bring it to the West, to make it more accessible in the modern world, and to establish an order that's neither monk nor lay. So there's a lot of similarities there. And Sangha famously said that commitment in the spiritual life is primary. Sangha Gita talked about that last week, and lifestyle secondary. Although he did also add that lifestyle is not unimportant, but nonetheless, the commitment is what it's about. So anyway, so that's a bit of background to Shinran and where he found himself. Okay. Now, to understand Shinran, you also need to know something about this Pureland tradition, okay, which is a huge tradition, but probably the biggest single tradition in the world. And there's so much that could be said about Pureland Buddhism, but I'll just stick to a few things most relevant to Shinran. Now, you must remember, okay, that we are very much in the territory of myth, and a myth which is very, very important to a tradition, but to some extent we may find quite difficult to take on board using our sort of, if you like, our more rational ways of thinking. Now, the development of Pureland practice goes right back to early Buddhism, because over many centuries, people have been meditating on the Buddha and contemplating his qualities, Buddha-Nusati practice. And indeed, many people practice it here. But this practice actually developed and extended over time to archetypal Buddhas, Bodhisattva figures who embody particular qualities like compassion, wisdom, energy, and fearlessness. Now, I won't try and justify these figures. You've all encountered them in various ways, or even use some of the conventional explanations. People talk about the white light of the Buddha, in a sense, passing through a prism and being split into light that represents different qualities. And that's all great as an explanation. I think it's great. But what I want to focus on is the way that these figures actually came to represent very deep forces in reality to people, as though reality itself in a way is communicating through these forms. And this is something I'll be returning to more. And it's hard to know where to go with that at this stage, but what I will do is I'll just move on to the key figure, really, of the Pureland tradition, which is the Buddha Amitabha. And Amitabha, as many of you will know, embodies compassion. Panyaradai gave a fantastic talk on Amitabha as the embodiment of compassion as a part of our last series on living with kindness. But to give you a flavour, he's often portrayed as a gorgeous sort of ruby red figure in deep meditation, sending compassion to all beings. And there's a beauty and compassion in his countenance which is simply beyond description. Beautiful, beautiful image. And this figure of Amitabha is said to have a mythic realm or Pure Land where beings live under his benign influence. And this connection to Amitabha grew to become absolutely central to the Pure Land tradition. It's what the Pure Land tradition, in a sense, is built on. Because practitioners in the Pure Land are seeking to be reborn in this Pure Land, Sukhavati, using mantras and visualizations and so on. And there's a really key vow that Amitabha made before he became enlightened, that all beings who with sincere mind rejoice in faith, aspire to be reborn in my land. They do this just 10 times, they'll be reborn in Sukhavati. So that's obviously a massive thing, okay, a massive thing. And according to the Pureland tradition, the purpose of the spiritual life is to try and cultivate the necessary faith, to be reborn in this pure land, okay? Now, some of you, I bet, have got what I call God antennae starting to appear, and I can see them waving around. You're beginning to think, uh-oh. Anyway, bear with me, bear with me. Because whatever you think of this myth, as I say, it's central to the Pureland tradition and to Shinran's school. And it often seems to us a million miles away from Buddhism as perhaps we know it. Now, the practices of Pureland Buddhism were simplified by Honen and Shinran to just calling on Buddha Amida. And Amida we can see as Amitabha, just about. Amida is the Amita part, meaning just infinite, because Amitabha is infinite light. So it's the infinite, which you could see as reality. And the way to do this was to chant the Nembutsu, which is Namo Amida Butsu, homage to Amida Buddha. And this chant is central to Shinran's tradition, and practitioners will do it many, many, many times. If you look at a picture of Shinran, and I could only find one, and there is a figure up there, but I've also got it here, you'll see that he's got a mala. He's doing a lot of counting of mantras. Okay, that's absolutely central to the tradition. The thing about Shinran is he went all the way with this. There was no holding him back. This was it. Okay, and he took it way beyond what many people would have imagined was possible. So yeah, it was all the way with Shinran, all the way. So you're probably thinking, why did Shinran think this was it? This practice, primarily this practice. And I think actually, as strange as it may seem to us with our meditation and our study and all our sort of practices, I think there's something actually very, very profound here. Last week, we looked at the idea of commitment. Sangha Gita took us through commitment as a central part of Buddhist practice. So this week, we're going to be looking at the central role of faith. Faith, sometimes called the path of surrendering to other power or other or reality. There's all sorts of ways you can put it. We probably shouldn't worry too much about the words. So yeah, so where you must be thinking, does this come into Buddhism? So, okay, let's start with the basic thing. The essential challenge of the spiritual life is how do we, as we are now, with all our samskaras, our habits, our egocentric patterns of behavior, how do we move towards enlightenment? And Subhuti, a senior order member, has been really helpful here because he suggested actually a way of looking at these things as 3 myths of the spiritual life. 3 myths, okay. The first myth, and by the way, myth is not to say wrong, okay, I'm sure you will know that by now. But myth is just like an approach, and we should see it in that sort of way. So the mainstream approach in Buddhism is what is usually called self-development, the myth of self-development. It says, if I cultivate myself, practice ethics, meditation, wisdom, act with love and compassion, I can become more mindful, more wise, more compassionate. So I develop myself to become more like the Buddha. And this is the mainstream approach in Buddhism. It's what we focus on in the introduction course. It's basically saying, if we make an effort, we need to put in effort, okay? And this approach has been strongly emphasized by our founder, Sangharakshita. However, sometimes we might see if we do appear to be successful in any shape or form, it can make us a bit arrogant. It can make us feel that in some senses we're self-made practitioners, okay? And our egos are very good at appropriating any sort of sense of progress. So it can be self-defeating. So that's self-development. Another approach is called self-discovery. And this, in a way, is quite subtle. It's basically saying, I'm already a Buddha, okay? Which is quite a powerful thing to say, isn't it? Spiritual practice, in effect, is one of uncovering this, sometimes called underlying Buddha nature. Now, this is obviously a really, really profound idea, and there'll be more said about it, I'm sure, when some of the other figures are talked about later on in this theme. But basically, your spiritual journey is to find your true nature. And this approach is well known to Shinran. And people who pursue this path, it's not like it's necessarily an easy path, although obviously that is always a potential risk that people see that they're already Buddhas. But actually, my experience of people who follow this myth strongly is that's not true at all, because there's an awful lot to get out of the way before the Buddha nature kind of shines through. Yeah. It can also, again, make us rather arrogant and forget, and maybe we forget that we're opening up to something beyond our day-to-day experience. But this is a popular approach in the West and resonates, I know, with many of us. But both these approaches, Shinran is saying, hold your horses. Hold your horses. Stop this, Shinran is saying. Using self-power, he would say, in any shape or form, is self-defeating. You can never become, he says, enlightened by self-power. Why, you might ask? Self-development, self-discovery, they sound quite reasonable. Because, he says, we're all bombus. We're all bombus, that's right. We're all bombus. Now, you can look up Bombu, Google it, and you get nice, polite explanations that it's something to do with being a bit deluded and not feeling, somebody, you have a bit of ill will and a bit of craving, a bit of all this. No, I think Bombu means that we're complete idiots. That's what it means. I'm an idiot. You're idiots. We're all idiots. That's what Bombu means. It means we're all idiots. You could say that order members are just better at being idiots. I mean, Shinran talks about the calculating mind. We're always looking for what's in it for me. Now, you can imagine, sitting down, watching a box set, stuffing your face with chocolate. You're obviously in it for yourself, okay? And that's fine. Nobody's going to question that. But what he's saying is that this is a problem that's also true in meditation for me, is that you sit down and you think, what's in this for me? Oh, yeah, it can make me feel better, a bit calmer. You get into that, and you are kind of coming in with all these expectations and hopes about what it's going to deliver. You can act generously. I think I've spoken about when I gave somebody this gift, and I had this sort of back of my mind as hoping he'd be my friend afterwards. That didn't happen. It didn't happen. But I had that little calculation going on in my mind. And Shinran is saying, you can't help that. That's going to happen whatever you do. You're not going to get anywhere with self-power. Indeed, it's just going to get in the way. It's just going to get in the way. You're probably thinking, God, that sounds a bit pessimistic, Vimaladasa. But that's not how Shinran saw it. No, he found the idea as liberating. He found it as liberating. So, what's the answer? Well, Shinran would say the answer is to rely on a being who has become enlightened, okay? Who can help you. In other words, bring in something that you might term other power or other reality. We could just say the Buddha. Let's be done with it. He was referring to Amida because in Japan and in the Pureland tradition, it's Buddha Amitabha that's the center of their tradition. Amida, meaning infinite, who's promised to lead anyone who calls on him with faith to his Pureland, even those who are unskillful. So basically, he's saying that Amida would accept us completely as we are. You could say, well, that's kind of handy. But this other power is not some abstract idea. It's not some nice idea. This is something very real. It's something or being that's beyond us, beyond our limited sort of self. According to Shinran, we call on Amida not in order to be reborn in his land. We can't even call on Amida because self-power is going to get in the way. It's going to come in through the back door. I'm calling on Amida just so that I can get into the Pure Land. Again, self-power. coming back in, the ego appropriating. Instead, you call on Amida as an expression of gratitude for the fact that you're already there. We've been taken, or grasped, it's sometimes said by Amida, to his Pureland. And all we have to do, I say all, okay, is surrender to it. You could say Shinran, in a sense, have taken the myth of Amitabha, and Amitabha's Pureland, to this literal extreme. He's just gone the whole way with this idea. Now I can see the red lights of your God antenna absolutely going off big time now, and I completely understand why that might be, with good reason. Because I'm sure you're already beginning to see some of the downsides. It can just sound, well, just lazy. All you have to do is say, save me. But of course, there's a complete lack of agency here, a lack of taking responsibilities. It can potentially, this would be a worry, lead to unskillfulness. And indeed, there are examples of practitioners who, well, you can imagine it, can't you? Sit back, smoke cigars, drink, laze around, enjoy the good life. And they just say, well, I'm fine, I'm saved. I don't need to make any effort. And obviously, that would be a spiritual disaster, absolute disaster. And this was accusations made by the Buddhist authorities back in the 13th century. So it's not the first time it's been made, but they actually executed 2 people who did that. Okay, we don't do that these days. We just shake our heads and scratch our beards. So you could come along to the Buddhist Centre once a week, do the practices, go home, and not change anything about the way you live your life. A bit like, I was going to say a Sunday morning Buddhist, but a Tuesday evening Buddhist. You know, there's no transformation. You know, this path could be seriously delusional. But actually, when you think about what surrender means, actually it's not as easy as it sounds. Because, how do you really surrender yourself? I can't even trust myself on a fairground ride, you know. In fact, I avoid them because they just terrify the life out of me. So how can I entrust my whole being, my whole life, to some higher being, higher sense of reality that I don't even have a tangible, concrete sense of? So Shinran introduced another important idea here, something called Shinjin, true entrusting. And this true or complete entrusting is seen as a faith, if you like, that's bestowed on us by Amida. It doesn't come from our deluded minds. What we have to do is to realize that we're bombus and completely entrust ourselves to Amida. When we do that, entrust ourselves to Amida, they or he give us their true mind, okay? And this can be seen as realization, enlightenment, the true mind. Although, of course, we're still subject to karma and samskara and so on, we basically see the world through the true mind of Amida, through the mind of infinity, through the mind of reality. So Amida is reality in a way pulling us towards him. And all we have to do is to be grateful to Amida because we're already there. Now, remember myth. Remember, we're in the world of myth. According to Sangha, this is equivalent to pure egolessness. Pure egolessness. When you think about that, it's actually brought us back to square one. I'd originally gone on this trail hoping that surrendering would be an easier path than self-development. But actually, when you think about what pure egolessness means in order to surrender, actually, in a way, it hasn't changed things that much. You can say, it's the same as realizing no self, egolessness. In a way, it's another path, and its important aspects I'll be exploring in a bit. But it's not an easy cop out. Indeed, Sangha argued it was a harder path in self-development. Anyway, so let's bring back our critical faculties. So you're probably thinking, isn't this God through the back door? Maybe this is why it hasn't taken off in the West, because a lot of people, at least in the past, came to Buddhist centers like this to get away from God. So if anything sounded a bit like God, they were like, Is that right? I don't remember. Less so now. I mean, Amida is not an all-powerful creator God. They represent something, reality reaching to us, but it's not God. They don't judge us. They don't mete out punishments. They represent the transcendental nature of reality, but there is something that there is, and that there is, in a sense, something beyond our mundane selves. So Shinran's teaching is radical. It turns Buddhism as we know it on its head, and he's a key figure, as I say, in this very successful school called Shin Buddhism. But he's not what you might call mainstream, even in Triratna. But his teachings, I think, can inspire our practice. So I just wanted to say a little bit about what Shinran and his teachings means to me, and you can see if you relate to it in the same way or not. So yes, traditional teaching starts with the path of self-development, and I agree it's essential, particularly in the early part of your spiritual life. And Daniel jokingly says that that's at least the first few decades, of your life as a practitioner. And indeed, this path of self-development continues for all of us. But when I think about what brought me to Buddhism, and what keeps me committed, I would say it's not self-development for its own sake. It's not about even self-improvement, if that means making me a good person. It's not a yoga class. It's not a self-help group. In a way, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, I don't even want to be ethical, at least not for its own sake. So I have to ask myself, why do I practice? And when I first came to the centre, I suppose I was expecting some great teaching that would just instantly give me the answer, if you like. But what I got was something that really resonated, something much, much deeper. As I was being helped, as I remember, and I always remember this, as I was being helped to park my car in front of this building by my dear friend Amoga Vamsa all those years ago, what I got was a sense of something reaching out to me. And I got that as I walked into the building, I got that from the teachings, and that is something that's been really important in my practice for the last 20 years. In a sense, I find it easier to see my practice of ethics, meditation, study, and spiritual friendship as expressions of something deeper, a way of connecting with some sort of current of reality, something inexpressible. Even, you could say, an expression of gratitude for having found the Dharma. So let's put it another way. If I stop practicing, say I'm on holiday, I'm enjoying my holiday, don't get me wrong, I do start to feel bereft. I start to feel like there's something missing from my life. To reconnect, though, what I need to do is to start practicing, because this helps re-establish my connection with something, somebody higher than me. And it's like a virtuous circle, because once I have this greater connection, I have the desire to practice more. And this idea, I think, is related to the idea of entrusting, or perhaps the more familiar Sanskrit word, Shraddha, often translated as faith. Faith is another word with big theological health warnings. So what is faith? So faith, Shraddha. Shraddha is not blind faith. Sangha says that the word derives from the root meaning to place the heart upon. And he says, and this response, this heartfelt response, when we come up against something higher, something beyond, some symbol of something higher, this response is what in Buddhism we call Shraddha, or faith. Now, Shraddha, in other words, is like our sort of response to truth in whatever form it presents. And this involves all aspects of our being. Traditionally, it's broken down into three forms. We've only got two lists tonight, and they've both only got three things in them. Okay, so you've got off quite lightly. So, yeah, one is sometimes called lucid faith. This refers to our emotional response to ideals and values, when our heart response to spiritual values gives us a deep sense of what really matters to us. And I definitely relate to that. I think that's something I definitely felt back then. But many people get it from texts, symbols, things that their friends do. There's all sorts of ways that we can pick up on this. But faith does also involve the cognitive faculty. I hear a bit of a sigh of relief from some of you here. So, for example, if you hear one of the Buddha's teachings like conditionality, you see in a sense that it makes sense, that we're all interconnected. The Buddha also urges that we try out these teachings, which will appeal to all the empiricists amongst you. So for example, the Metta-bhavana, practice the Metta-bhavana, something we talked a lot about in the last theme. And you can see that practicing the Metta-bhavana actually helps my relationships with other people. So, and this leads to a sense of conviction, deep conviction, okay, which is another form of faith. But lastly about faith, it's not passive. It's not something that you just sat on your sofa, okay? It's not passive. It actually comes with a strong desire to move towards the spiritual qualities that you admire and maybe see in others. And in a sense, these things are possible. You see that these things are possible in your life. So there's a really strong volitional aspect to faith. You can see that it's a long way from the idea of blind faith. And to me, this is what draws me anyway to Buddhism and practicing the Dharma. I just wanted to end with a very well-known Sangha quote on this. Now, Shraddha, this faith, is not just a belief, not believing something to be true. We may say that Shraddha in this sense, in this context, is the response of our total being, or what is ultimate in us to what is ultimate in the universe. So I'll just conclude with what can we learn from Shinran and the path of surrendering. You've already gathered. I find Shinran very inspiring. He offers to me he really, really brings home the central importance of Shraddha, faith in our spiritual life. He brings out the transcendental. As I say, this is not a secular self-help group. There has been a tendency, I think, in Buddhism, perhaps in some of its forms in the West, to secularize Buddhism. Terms like insight can make it sound very rational and logical. But if you stop there, you won't get very far. You could say Shinran brings religion back into Buddhism, where it's always been. He also brings this element of surrendering to what is higher in our practice, rather than just surrendering to our own ego. Because the ego is very good at taking over practices, very good at taking over what we think are our achievements, my realization, and so on. But what he emphasizes, it's not us. It's not us. So in trusting is like letting go in meditation, letting go in your breath, better still, letting go into metta. The great thing about Shinran's teaching is you don't have to generate metta. You just open to it, surrender to it. It's a gift. All you have to do is wish it for other people. Vedanya mentions that in his practice of Metta-bhavana, he has a figure like the Buddha or Amitabha in his practice and leaves them to generate metta, because in a way, they are the metta. So when my practice slips, I often find it's a result of a lack of faith. And I'm very grateful to Shinran because he articulates in a mythic form the importance of connecting with the Buddha calling to us right now. While the Nembutsu chant may seem very limited and not likely to catch on in Triratna, I'm very grateful to Shinran and the Pureland school, the true Pureland school, for showing me the centrality of faith and surrendering to something beyond my current limited self. Thank you.